Welcome to the Candice Malcolm Show. I'm Kris Sims. I'm the Alberta Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, guest hosting for Candice sometimes this summer. Thank you so much for making us a part of your week. It's really important to us in order to spread the word. If you haven't done so already, make sure you hit that subscribe button and share this show with your friends who want the real deal coming from independent media. Okay, so lots to do this week. And I wanted to highlight something for all of our listeners and viewers. And I wanted them to ask themselves this question. Are you getting good value for the money you pay for government? Think of the services that you get from government. Are they top notch? Are they gold standard? Do you brag to your friends and family about them? I'm sorry for laughing, but the answer is obviously no. The Fraser Institute did great work the other day where they point out in their annual report that we are paying more in taxes than we are for food, clothing, and shelter and housing combined. We're paying more in taxes than we are for food, clothing, and shelter. That's from 3 various levels of government, so municipal, provincial, and federal. It's a disgusting waste of money. I'm going to zero in on the federal here, and I want to kick this off with pointing it out that Prime Minister Mark Carney is taking vacation again. This is an email that was sent out to the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Let's just read it together. To all Press Gallery members, while remaining in the National Capital Region and surrounding area, the Prime Minister will be on a reduced schedule in the week of August the 11th, that's today, to reflect a brief period of local vacation. As he does so, he will remain in close coordination with his team and officials on several economic and security priorities for the weeks ahead. Media advisories will be distributed should any public events arise during this time. Best PMO team. PMO stands for Prime Minister's Office for folks who aren't huge political nerds. Now, granted, Prime Minister is a human being. Human beings, if you can, should try to take a vacation, especially when the weather is good. Okay? We get that. But a couple of things. One, Prime Minister Mark Carney already did take a vacation earlier this summer. And 2, this is where we get down to value for money and keeping promises and being accountable. Folks might remember that during the national election campaign, we were hearing all sorts of things like, oh, by Canada Day, I think it was, we're going to get rid of interprovincial trade barriers and problems. Okay, number one, anyone who's worked in government knows that that was a really silly promise to try to make, because actually most of the interprovincial trade barriers we have in Canada are with the provinces themselves. So we do have some issues with the feds getting their nose in there and screwing things up for interprovincial trade, but a lot of it is actually on the provincial governments themselves. So Carney shouldn't have made that promise. Also, if we take a look at what is happening south of the border and compare to what's happening up here, you got to start asking yourself if you're getting good value for money. Because again, taxpayers pay a ton of money for the work of government. I wanted to pull up the schedule here. It's the calendar schedule for the sitting of the House of Commons. So these are all the members of Parliament, okay, where they all gather together in Ottawa. And this is when they are physically in session in the House of Commons, the big building, the big room with the green carpet, okay? So take a look here. Okay. 1 week tacked on at the end of May and 3-ish weeks tacked on in June and nothing until the end of August, okay? The House will resume sitting in the fall. But I want you to ask yourself, are you getting good value for money from those politicians? Okay. We've got more than 300 members of parliament. If you add up all of their base salaries, that's costing taxpayers more than $70 million. That's just the base MP salary, because they're all paid more than 200 grand a year. That's not including the cabinet ministers and the coin they make. That's not including the prime minister and the money he makes. So $70 million just in salaries for members of parliament. And pull that calendar back up again so I can take a look at that. And they're sitting this many days? I don't know, man. That's not a really good return on investment. Now, to be very clear and fair, there are a couple of committees that are squeaking in some work here and there. So I do want to acknowledge that. because people do need to pay more attention to what's happening at committee. So I was hearing people talking about the BC Ferries deal they were making with China, etc. There were some MPs and some staff and clerks who were working in the summer for committee. That's good. The point here is, are you getting great value for money from your government? That's just the politicians. This might blow your mind. Take a look at the permanent government cost. The US President Donald Trump would call it the swamp. I would call it permanent government. And that's bureaucracies. So it's not just the MPs, of course, who are in the House of Commons or not. It's the bureaucrats who are working in all of these departments. They don't run for election. They don't need to put their name on a ballot. They're making, on average, more than $120,000 per year each. The cost of the bureaucracy for taxpayers last year was more than 70 billion with a B. Yeah, easy to remember this, guys. The politicians, the MPs, they're costing you 70 million. The bureaucrats, 70 billion. So add 3 more zeros onto that tax bill. So this is an outrageous amount of money. We need to demand good value for money from our various levels of government. I wanted to point out also that we often hear things like, oh, we're in the middle of a tariff war, we're in the middle of a trade war with US President Donald Trump, et cetera, et cetera. As a taxpayer, I don't care about the personal, behavior between two people, if that's Mark Carney and Donald Trump. Work it out. Work it out. Because you have got millions of people counting on your departments to work out a trade deal. The fact that we have not been able to resolve the ongoing tariff dispute and the responses is just increasing our tariffs on both sides of the border, that only hurts normal working people. Tariffs are simply trade taxes. That's all that is. It just winds up costing you more money. In practical situations, it can be everything from the extra charge now on Alberta energy, which is a huge issue, to even simple little things at the grocery store. It's one of the reasons why you're not seeing pickles on the shelf coming from the United States. So people who are out grocery shopping can see the real effects of this happening. And then we've got entire industries that are holding their breath. People in the steel industry that are holding their breath, waiting to see what happens with their jobs. We've got a combination of tariffs coming from the United States and a looming, huge industrial carbon tax coming from Prime Minister Mark Carney. And yet we look across the border and we do more than $1 trillion worth of trade with the United States per year. I think we have a screenshot of this. It's from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. I would highly recommend going to their website. Look at this. This is the numbers. 1.3 trillion in annual two-way trade between Canada and the United States. For investment, we're going to be speaking about investment really soon here with Michael Campbell, more than 1.7 trillion. So 1.4 million American jobs are supported by exports to Canada. You cannot overemphasize this importance enough. And what we're getting is kind of simple, dumb slogans online in the media between these two departments and no deal. Why are we seeing US President Donald Trump inking huge deals for their natural resources? They certainly found a market demand for their natural gas, right? He's signing these big deals, and he's also getting mega corporations to come to the United States and open up shop there. Why isn't this happening here in Canada? And the reason why it's important to focus on this is because if you don't have big companies coming in with confidence and doing business in your country, the government's just going to wrench money out of you, They're going to increase your taxes even more. Because if you don't have good resource development and you don't have good business investment, they're going to find that money somewhere, They're not going to try to cut their own costs. They're going to be bloodsuckers and they're going to come after you. So why is it that we aren't able to find a huge export market for our natural gas yet? We are seeing some ships head out, which is good, but we're seeing the opposite happen. We're seeing great deals happen in the United States. This drills down to departments doing their job well or not. Doesn't have anything to do with the political jersey or the color of the jersey that the Prime Minister or his department's wearing. We pay people in the Department of Finance and Treasury and International Trade to deal with this. Like, this is a them problem. This is not an us Canadians problem. They need to actually figure that out. I wanted to end on a couple of things here really quick, okay? Again, I want you to do a thought process and ask yourself if you're getting good value for money. We're working on our gas tax honesty report for this month, highlighting how many taxes you pay at the pump. And one of the really good things that I saw compared to last year is the consumer carbon tax is gone. And yes, it's actually been repealed now. It's technically gone. And so at the pump, largely in most places in Canada, it's 20 cents cheaper per liter than it was last summer. That's because the carbon tax is gone. I did some really frightening math a few weeks ago, and I added up how much the current government had taken from us in the carbon tax since it was first imposed back in 2019. It's more than $40 billion. $40 billion plus dollars. That's just the federal carbon tax. That's not including British Columbia or Quebec. Just to do a bit of quick math, $40 billion collected in the carbon tax because they said it was super duper important could buy around 800 water bomber planes. That might have been a smart investment, but instead, we're $40 billion poorer, and they're not talking about it. What we do need to talk about is where Canada is headed, how we're going to start getting good value for money out of our government and kick the government into action and making sure that they are getting good investment in our country. How are we going to do that? Let's find out. Joining me now is Michael Campbell. He is the host of Money Talks. And whenever I have a business question, whenever I'm wondering to myself, do we really not have a business case for natural gas in Canada? I tune in to what Michael Campbell is saying for real. So you can follow his show. You can follow him online. He's, I would say, a frequent commentator on all things politics on social media. Michael, thank you so much for joining the show and welcome to the Candice Malcolm Show.
My pleasure. And it's interesting. What I look at is economics and finance. And I'd love never to talk about politics because people sometimes are irrational about it. They have a tribalism. That's not what 2 + 2 = 4 is about when you talk about finance. But how can't you when you have so much intervention into the economy, whether it's our standard of living? Well, taxes are my biggest expense. That's political. Interest rates are the Bank of Canada, but also influenced, of course, by, fiscal policy there. Housing. How can you not talk government if you're worried about housing? My big thing is I'm worried about our young people, looking at the highest rate of unemployment since 2010 ex-pandemic, but 14.6%. Or, those kinds of things. So you're forced into chatting about politics. And one of the things politicians do very well is forget to tell us the consequences, the full story. They don't say, okay, there's always a consequence to any policy. Then you get to decide, or I think the public should, do I like that consequence or not? And so, just correct that. I'm in the finance and economics, and that forces me into politics.
I knew you were reluctant to get into politics, but here you are, because
Yeah.
as the old saying goes, you may not take an interest in politics, but politics will take an interest in you. And that's exactly for the reasons you just mentioned there. We've been talking for years, and, TransCanada, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, that's a perfect example of where it was a private company, Kinder Morgan, that had all their ducks lined up in a row. They're going to spend their own money twinning their own property, the pipeline that ran from Edmonton out to Burnaby, to try to get Alberta's oil and gas to market. But here we go. We've got the Trudeau government getting involved, foot dragging until the company throws its hands up in the air, leaves, and now taxpayers are on the hook for it. We had similar interference for a pipeline going out east, similar interference again with Northern Gateway, and suddenly there's a big tanker ban. So to your point exactly, you may be reluctant to have to comment on politics, but man, those politicians are really getting up in your grill. And so I wanted to speak with you specifically about this because we take a look at what's going on right now down south. we take a look at this ongoing trade war that's going on, this tariff war, and there's all this, silly childish language of elbows up and we should be best friends. And like, I don't care. Like, quit talking like an 8-year-old. What I care about is the fact that we've got billions and billions of dollars on the line here. We're not getting along with our biggest trading partner. And all we need to do is look at what the deals are that US President Donald Trump is doing here. He's finding deals for his natural resources. He's convincing mega corporations to do business in the United States, Apple for one. And
Mhm.
I'm taking a look at what's going on in Ottawa. I am not seeing the same up to snuff work going on here. I got to ask you, because I'm not a business person. You understand this world. Is there a market demand around the world for Canada's natural gas? Would they buy it if we had it ready to go?
Well, I think the best story we've had economically in the last short while has to be the first shipments of LNG going to Asia.
Exactly.
The first boat went, of course, and it did get some coverage. I think another three, though, are leaving right now. So there's a huge appetite. Also, it's become a recognition that if you really want to, if your big worry is global emissions, well, natural gas is far superior to coal. And so if we can ship and get China off coal, for example, that'll have a monstrous impact. But then on the other side, where Prime Minister Trudeau famously said there was no business case, looking at supplying Europe. I mean, I think it was very short-sighted, but I also look at what the US has done recently. They've signed some major deals for LNG going there. It's just that it was such a glib statement, a glib attitude that was born out of their ideology of no fossil fuels. Well, that's proved incorrect. And as I say, thank goodness we're doing something out of the West Coast. Could have been easier, but happy to see it. Happy to see there is a Kinder Morgan, despite the fact that you're absolutely accurate. I think the numbers they were throwing around when Trans Mountain, Kinder Morgan was talking about $7-8 billion. It ended up $34 billion. But you know what? It still makes sense because up till then, we were forced to sell so much of our oil coming out of Alberta at a discount, Western Canada Select. Well, that discount shrunk dramatically because now we can access other markets. So I think in the end, yeah, I'm not happy about spending about 25 billion more than we thought, but it still makes sense economically. And so would another pipeline. And that's what they're talking about. But as people will certainly are aware of, BC Premier David Eby made the comment, no pipelines on my watch.
Yeah.
Absurd, but at anyways, it's there. But yeah, so that's the challenge. There is an LNG market. There is a market for our energy. And can we get it efficiently and safely in pipelines, win that battle hands down against rail or trucking or whatever way we want to do it?
I listen to your show often, and what I like about your show and your delivery is that you can explain business situations in a way that normal people understand, even if they're not a business person themselves, like myself included.
Mhm.
And what you highlighted quite often is trust.
Yes.
So, business owners or people who want to invest need to have trust in where they're putting their money, similar to a personal relationship. Okay. You need to have trust. Can you go over this a little bit?
Yeah.
Where are we as a country on the trust factor? So, say, I've got this image in my mind of some big rich person who's got a huge company and they want to invest their money in Canada geographically. It could be a gold mine, it could be a fuel refinery, whatever that is. Okay, manufacturing.
Yeah.
Where's the trust level right now with the Carney government versus the Trudeau government?
Well, I don't think there's a big change. That's the problem. There was no trust with the Trudeau government. And I'll give you a quick example because there has been a lot of talk about pipelines, and keep in mind, what was the experience of Enbridge at the Northern Gateway pipeline? It went through all the hoops. It had conditional cabinet approval. I think they did 180 sort of public consultations. They had 4 out of 5 Indigenous groups supporting it. Here's the key, they spent $500 million in that process. And then what happens at the end? Cabinet withdraws their approval. They put in a northern tanker ban, which basically said you don't need a pipeline. Well, if I'm Enbridge, how fast do I want to get into business again with the governments of Canada? How fast do I want? And you can say, well, no, but it's Mark Carney. Well, Mark Carney's surrounded by many of the same players in cabinet. When they look across the table, they're still looking at Chrystia Freeland, Champagne. They're looking at I'm just trying to think. Guilbeault, my goodness
Yeah.
gracious, when they look at Guilbeault, they cry and have an Excedrin break, And he's already made comments that are consistent with what he had said before, like we don't need another pipeline because Trans Mountain's already full. Completely false, inaccurate, but it's the attitude. And it is a confidence problem. And I mean, I look at confidence as an overall thing. I mean, our whole financial system works on confidence. You put your money in a bank, you keep it there because you believe you can get it back. If you heard rumors that you weren't going to, believe me, you'd get your money out of there. It's so when you come right down to investment decisions, I think it's important to understand a sharp distinction between the study of economics and actual, I'm making a $500 million investment. Or if it's you and I, we may be making a $10,000 stock investment. It doesn't matter. That's where the confidence comes in. And I think that the federal government has not, under Mr. Carney, has not been realistic about what a challenge that is. And, he's talked a big game. We're going to lead the G7. Sometimes I think, well, that's damning with faint praise when I look at what's going on in Europe. But anyways, we're going to lead the G7 and we're going to do this and that. Well, everyone, doesn't matter your political stripe. It doesn't matter who you voted for. It starts with capital investment. Whether you want to start your own store, you said, I want a hair salon, I want a nail salon. Well, it takes capital. Doesn't matter what the situation. So if you want to grow the economy, it starts with capital investment. Canada has a significant trust issue. And sorry, I know I'm going on, but
No.
that's reputation. that guy can never stop talking, for goodness sakes. But let me add one more thing that's underappreciated. We are in a competition for capital. No different, again, if you were selecting a stock, you would have a whole universe of things to put your money in. If you're selecting an investment property, same thing. Across the country, maybe you go internationally. Well, it's the same with major investments. They have tons of selection. And unfortunately, we're against President Trump and the US. Well, what have they just done? Talked a big game and followed through on reducing corporate taxes, keeping them attractive, on talking about reducing the cost of regulation. If you just stood back and said, well, which sounds a little more likely that I'll make a profit, unfortunately, the US wins. And now they're adding on to it, by the way. It's an interesting aspect of the tariffs. And we saw that with Apple saying, we're going to manufacture in the US so we don't even have to talk about tariffs for that product, and makes a deal around it. And there's other companies doing it. So Canada has to first appreciate how intense the competition for capital is. And we have a bad reputation on that score. And it doesn't matter, again, who you voted for. That's the reality. We've seen it in the capital investment numbers.
I'd put it this way for people who don't, invest in stocks and things. Just imagine if you were trying to buy a second house. Imagine if you're trying to buy a second house and you wanted to say, do it for rental. You wanted people to rent your home. You would look at the crime stats. You would look at the neighborhood. You would find out how often garbage is picked up around there. You'd find out if there's schools. You do the tire kicking on the neighborhood before you put your money into it.
Absolutely.
And now there you go. And now we've got companies that are kicking the tires on Canada saying, I'm not so sure about this. I wanted to touch on something here because you are in British Columbia and you do follow stuff very closely. And you mentioned in the case of Northern Gateway, where they had 4 of the 5 First Nations groups on board, but it still turned into nothing. Are you following this decision, the so-called Cowichan situation, where it looks like a judge has, I'm just paraphrasing, basically said, yeah, private property rights do not trump Aboriginal rights when it comes to land. So this set off a whole bunch of alarm bells late last week. And, the Taxpayers Federation are keeping an eye on it because this could obviously have huge implications on private property, which you pay property taxes for at the very bare minimum. So are you following this? Is this making a lot of headlines in BC?
Absolutely. But it's right back to what you said. Think about the uncertainty that's produced. This was a 600-page judgment, and there's I hope it gets appealed, but people will sift through it. And what does it mean? In the meantime, all about uncertainty. And the problem is it comes on the heels of last year when the government tried to push another similar kind of bill that gave First Nations the right of consultation. Like, we had to get First Nations. Look what Prime Minister Carney just said about, national projects have to have the cooperation of First Nations. Whether you think that's a great policy or not, you should appreciate that adds a level of uncertainty, again, especially against the backdrop of experiences like the Northern Gateway pipeline and others. BC cannot afford to have a weak economy. If they're watching across the country, may not be aware of the significant problems with the debt in BC. I mean, the British Columbia debt in the 2 years under NDP Premier David Eby is up about 45% in 2 years. Up 45%, for goodness sakes. You can't have that in any way sustainable without economic growth. Well, this is negative. I would challenge anyone, again, regardless of whether you think this is a good policy or not, to tell me how that encourages capital investment and will encourage economic growth, because it absolutely doesn't. Starting with even you asking the question, it shows the uncertainty and the prominence of this. And believe me, there's no one considering a significant investment in the province of British Columbia who's not first looking at this and wondering about it and thinking, again, there's other jurisdictions that don't have this roadblock.
This is it. And I think when people picture this ruling, which is again 600 pages, it's a
Yeah.
huge ruling. So we definitely need to follow it. When they picture the ruling, they might imagine somebody with, a house in Richmond,
Yeah.
trimming
That's
their
what I
hedges
do.
and
Yeah.
paying their taxes, which is fine. But there's the business issue there too, like you just mentioned. Like, for example, I know for a fact that the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the one that Kinder Morgan wanted to twin, like I mentioned,
Mhm.
they pay property taxes
Yeah.
because the pipeline physically goes through land. Okay. Like, these things have ramifications on businesses too, right? It
Absolutely.
isn't just
Yeah.
somebody who's a homeowner in Richmond, it's a business who might be looking at that region of BC, right?
Yeah. And again, I'd say it doesn't matter who you voted for. When you put your money somewhere, you want it back and plus a return, whether you call that a bank or a credit union or a major investment, or you've bought a warehouse and you're starting a business. All of that now has been put. This is getting talked a lot. You asked, is it on the agenda? It absolutely is. And it started again with Vancouver Sun's Vaughn Palmer going back last year, who did some great work. And I think that work was pivotal in derailing a similar uh, potential impact on the province of British Columbia. Again, giving First Nations sort of the right of refusal to projects. And that, again, the uncertainty kills them. And this is going to be talked about a great deal more, because I think people appreciate, especially these guys have now drilled it down to my home. Oh, I understand that. I may never want to do a business, major project, a plant, the equipment that goes into it, whatever. But I got a home, and they're telling me that my legal rights are superseded, by First Nations issues. Well, I'm just saying that doesn't make anybody comfortable. A lot of questions.
Speaking of comfort and business cases, I wanted to shift gears here, no pun intended, to the looming ban on the sale of gasoline and diesel powered vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
People often refer to it as the EV mandate, but
Yeah.
I find sometimes when we call it that, it kind of slips past people. And if you actually visualize this as a ban by the government on the sale of a regular internal combustion engine, that's a bigger deal. You can kind of imagine that better. And
Yeah.
again, if people choose to buy an electric vehicle, like that's on them. That's totally up to them. It may suit their needs. That's fine. The issue here is twofold. One, the government shouldn't be telling you what kind of vehicle you can drive. But
Mm-hmm.
two, especially from the Canadian taxpayer's perspective, we don't have the energy or the money for this. Like, the math is not mathing here.
Oh,
But I
there's a
wanted
ton of
to
things there.
ask you about the business case here, because last I saw the last quarterly report, I think the sales of electric vehicles are at 9%,
Yeah.
single digit, 9. Starting in 5 months' time, the federal government is going to mandate that be 20% of new vehicle sales. Is
And
there a business case here to force people to buy battery powered cars?
well, there's not a practical case, that's for sure. They can't do it. I mean, no, but flat out, they can't do it. As you say, 20% of sales in 2026, 60% nationwide. In British Columbia, it's 90% by 2030. So we're talking 4.5 years from now. And then 100%, I think it's 100% by 2035. But again,
Yep.
what they're talking about is of new vehicle sales. So if I already have an internal combustion engine, it's not impacting me. The resale value, I think, gets hit pretty good. But the other thing they've done at the same time, both federally and again out in British Columbia provincially, they've removed the rebates. So
Yes.
they've taken away the incentive to compensate me. And then the mandates, and they have been, I mean, there's been so much blowback from the industry itself saying this is literally impossible, but they still are saying they're sticking to their guns. And can I add one more aspect to this? We don't have the charging stations. Where are you going to charge your car up? And then the power demand that you've described is absolutely accurate. There's nothing practical in this. Forget we could have the sort of philosophical debate about internal combustion engines and the emissions and all that. And that is an important discussion to have. I'm just saying practically it can't happen.
I correspond with a gentleman named Blair King, who follows a lot of fuel and that sort of business. You're probably aware of him. He's in BC as well, and he did the math. To be fair, many years ago, so the adjustment for inflation and that might be changed. But he did the math, and he said just to change over ground transportation, this wasn't full factory heating or anything like that, but to change ground transportation, I believe he included commercial. British Columbia would need like 9 new Site C dams.
Yeah.
Which is just coming online now.
Yeah.
Like W.A.C. Bennett was the first premier who mentioned Site C because he already had A and B lined up for folks who don't know BC politics. That's why it's called Site C, because it's the third one. They just got that thing going now. I think they first started talking about that, Michael, 20 years ago?
I can't even do the math on that one.
25? I think I was graduating journalism school back then. And so my point here is we don't have the energy and we don't have the money to build the energy, do we?
But it's a typical example, and I can give you many more. And this is where I am critical, because when common sense gets thrown out, I love my example coming out of Germany when they closed down their nuclear plants and never thought about, well, where do we replace that power with? Like, are you crazy? Or gee, I didn't know that the sun and wind were intermittent power sources and we needed a backup. Really? Well, I've got a 4-year-old grandson who understands the wind doesn't blow every day. It's that caliber of thinking. And in this case, fine, if you want to do that, the electric vehicle thing, have a plan for the infrastructure, like to start with. And it's huge. I mean, that's a huge challenge there. Like, there's no practical way this is going to happen. That's what's going to be interesting, but it's going to really hurt the car dealers because they get penalized if they don't meet that mandate. 20% of their sales has to have been, it's not the consumer, it's I'm a car dealer. 20% of my sales must be EVs. And as I say, that's next year, and 60% by 2030 and 90% in BC. I mean, there's just so much impractical about it. I can't resist giving everyone a headache with this stat. Think about this. They want us all in electric vehicles. Okay, so what do? Put 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, which we'd be selling for about half the price with high quality choices there. So wait, we're going to make it more expensive, less likely that people will adopt, and we'll get rid of the rebates to make sure they don't adopt. And then we see it in the sales figures almost immediately, the plunging EV sales without the rebates. It just doesn't make sense. I'm not even getting into the philosophical debate or whether we should or shouldn't. I'm saying what they've proposed, I know we want people to buy cars. We'll make it even less attractive if they do.
This is what's mind-blowing to me. We only have a couple of minutes left here, but I wanted to point out 2 things. One, Natural Resources Canada has already outsourced a project on this and done the math. That report, which is on the Government of Canada's website, says that transitioning to electric vehicles is going to cost upwards of $300 billion with a B. This is in a situation where a country has unmoney, okay? The Trudeau government doubled our debt. We're more than $1 trillion in debt. The interest payments alone on our doubled debt now, our $1.2 trillion debt, is $1 billion a week.
Yeah.
To visualize this, folks, imagine every Saturday night, instead of gathering around the hockey game, we picture a brand new hospital, all full of bells and whistles and paint and stuff, ready to go. Instead of cutting the ribbon and going in, we burn it down.
Yeah. Well,
we burn it down. That's just the interest.
This is a huge discussion about the debt. And I'll give people quickly. It's no different in your own life. If you borrowed $100,000 and threw a hell of a party, that's the limit of it. So it's that we have borrowed a lot of money and much of it is not productive. It's not got into productive exercises. It's not like when a company borrows and says, I'm borrowing at 5%, I think I'll make 15% on that. No, that's not what we've done. I think what we've just hit on, though, is the biggest unappreciated story in the country today. We do not have a federal budget. I was looking to do some analysis just yesterday. Couldn't do it because I needed the budget numbers. And I wanted to see what are the interest expense forecast as we go out. Because we know that Prime Minister Carney's agenda is about double the cost in terms of debt of Prime Minister Trudeau's. Okay, so let me see the numbers. So that's a big one. But 92 billion, that's the CD Howe Institute came up with that for our deficit this year. Then I thought, well, no wonder they're not having a budget. They don't want us talking about that.
Yeah.
But I think this is a very serious case because this idea that we can run up these numbers without consequences is absurd. So we should be looking, okay, what are the consequences of running up those numbers? What are the other variables, i.e. you have to have economic growth if you're adding that much debt? That's certainly debatable. Right now, we're having an economy that's slow to shrinking, actually. Unemployment numbers are up, all of that stuff. And as I say, it merits a very focused discussion because I think we're just being glib about it at this point. It's being glossed over. And the last thing I'll finish with is, again, another example of how young Canadians are not on the agenda. Guess who's paying it off? Look at me. Look at my gray hair here. I'm not paying that off. I'm not paying the interest for maybe for another week. But let's hope I live a little longer.
Yeah, let's go with that.
But I mentioned my grandson. He'll be paying off the debt they are running up for 80 years.
Yep.
We'll never get off it.
Nope.
Well, we shouldn't be quite so casual about it. But again, now that's a political statement on my part, or philosophical value-related statement. Yeah. I can't believe how it's ignored. But we really have to have a more focused discussion on the amount of debt that the federal government's running up.
Speaking of debt, this is my last question for you. And I guess it's me pinning my hopes on something. That Mark Carney, when you look at him compared to what our previous prime minister's qualifications and capacities were, Mark Carney is the former governor of the Bank of Canada, the former governor of the Bank of England. He holds a master's degree from, I think it's Harvard, and then a PhD from Oxford in economics. Mm-hmm. Okay? So my point of all of this is this guy's no slouch. Okay? He should be able to understand hard math. And when push comes to shove, as Ben Shapiro says, facts don't care about your feelings. Yep. We have got a critical problem with our debt. We've got a serious confidence problem when it comes to investors, as you point out very well, people not wanting to do business here. So some rubber's going to have to hit the road here. Do you think that Mark Carney is going to cause a change? When they come back in the fall and they start sitting, do you see him shifting gears of this government?
Well, first thing is I'll be looking to see if he does. All we've done is so far is talk. And I know for some Canadians, that's plenty enough. That's good enough. I'm much more practical, and I know I frustrate some people that way. I'm, as I keep joking, I'm from Missouri, the show me state. Show me, get rid of the obstacles, the legislative obstacles to, a new pipeline, for example, or the oil and gas industry. Let's see lower corporate tax rates so we can compete for capital. And let's see a lower regulatory burden. Again, I agree with you. He understands those things, but I still need to see some action here. And we haven't seen any. And I think so much of our future, my children, grandchildren's future rests on our ability to do it. I'm not willing to bet whether he is or not. I'm willing to just see how it goes, but there will be some specifics. We will have to get beyond the happy talk soon. Again, that's not what investors are looking for, is more happy talk. They are looking specifically, does this project make sense? Does this investment make sense? What are my costs? Reduce their costs, especially against a U.S. government that's competing for capital so aggressively with ours. So we'll see.
Michael, this is why I count on you for things like this, because you won't tell me what I want to hear. You'll just bring the data and you'll look for it. Michael Campbell, host of Money Talks, thank you so much for joining us today on the Candice Malcolm Show.
My pleasure.
Folks, once again, that was Michael Campbell. He's been in the arena for a long time. He hosts a great show called Money Talks. You can follow him on social media as well. Got a lot of really sage analysis there. And I wanted to introduce him to the show because I've been following his stats and numbers for a long time. And this is where we get down to brass tacks, because it is super important for voices like this to get out to ears like yours through independent media. it is critically important that we grow our network, that we grow our base of independent media that asks hard questions, that does deep dives, and brings you hard data. And that is what we're doing here on the Candice Malcolm Show. So if this episode was interesting to you, if you feel like this is ringing some alarm bells and you want to send this to your friends who need a big wake-up call, do it. Share this show. Subscribe to the show. Better yet, make a donation and support Juno News.